Here's how I study and review content as a medical student. So I have a huge amount of content I need to cover and review for both my unit exams, which happen every couple weeks. And then I also have to remember everything I learn over the first 2 years of medical school for the Step 1 exam, which is a huge cumulative exam at the end of the preclinical curriculum, at least for US medical school students. So it's really important for me to be as efficient and organized as possible when I'm doing this, because otherwise, it would just be overwhelming and things would fall through the cracks. The system that I use that I'm about to share with you has been really helpful for me in saving time and making sure information is burned into my long-term memory. Hopefully you can benefit from it as well. So the core of this method is active recall and spaced repetition. For those of you who've looked into evidence-based study techniques before, you're probably really familiar with these terms. But for those of you new to this, I'll just give you a quick overview. To use active recall, it's just to force yourself to recreate information from your memory. So a good example of that is flashcards. You test yourself, you see a flashcard, you're not going to a textbook and trying to answer that flashcard or Googling it. You're just trying to pull it from memory. Same thing with practice questions, PQs, and then teaching others, if you're doing it without an aid. These are all great examples of active recall. But they're not the only examples, obviously, right? There are hundreds of different ways to pull stuff from your memory. The exact form factor just depends on preference as well as the type of information you're going over. Let's also talk about spacing a bit. Spaced repetition is something we all know to do. Very few people actually do it, though, because it's quite difficult, at least if you don't have a system for it. It's just the idea that you want to kind of spread out your revision so you don't do it every day and end up spending 24 hours a day of studying, but you also don't do it only right before the test and end up cramming and having to relearn stuff. So at least in the literature, what I've seen is a general suggestion about a 1 day, 1 week, and 1 month. As a medical student, I also do a midweek revision. And the reason for that is, again, I just have too much content to go through. Sometimes I'm covering an entire organ system of the body in 2-4 weeks. And so having that midweek revision really helps me out. For most people, that's probably overkill. All right, so now let's talk about the techniques that we're going to use to achieve these two concepts. And the technique to use kind of depends on the knowledge type that you're trying to review. So I broadly think of knowledge as one of two camps, either isolated facts or logical concepts. So let's talk about what those are now. Isolated facts are pieces of information that you can't really understand or logically think through. You have to memorize them. So for example, average heart rate for somebody, average blood pressure, the BNP level for a patient with heart failure or without heart failure. These are all things you can never really truly understand, right? These are numbers. You just have to memorize them. And for that, I typically use flashcards. Now, when I say flashcards, I'm not referring to the physical written flashcards, the ones where you buy index cards from Staples for a couple bucks and write out your own flashcards. I'm talking about online flashcards, and specifically an app called Anki. I use Anki. Most medical students use Anki, and pretty much all medical students who are using flashcards do indeed use Anki. The reason is it has a really sophisticated algorithm called the FSRS algorithm, which essentially figures out, based on how well you do on a card, when you should next see it. This is great because it takes out the need to have like a calendar or some sort of scheduling system along with your flashcards. It's all automatic. So I can just open up the app every day, finish the cards, and I know I'll have all that information covered. So that's for isolated facts. Now we're going to talk about the actual bulk of studying, which is logical concepts. So quick disclaimer here. I am going to refer to a system from now on which is built on the assumption that you are deeply processing and learning material in the first place. There's a guide for how to do that in the description, but if you aren't already doing that, this process probably won't work out for you. So now that that's out of the way, let's talk about how I do this. So the first part of learning logical concepts is actually learning them. Not just reading it, but learning it. So like I said, I put a guide to that in the description. I learn it deeply. I do have a bit of a time investment here. but it pays dividends once I start reviewing. So once it's learned, then I can move on to reviewing. And so at the end of this learning stage, I have a well-processed mind map. And this mind map has connections to all these sort of facts out there. And so now we need to start reviewing it daily, then midweek, and then monthly. And so let's talk about the one-day revision first. At the one-day revision, I will typically do what's called a reformatting of the mind map. And what that means is I will reword and redraw connections and redo a lot of the logic so that it's extremely intuitive and extremely simple for me to understand. This is important because this leverages what's called higher order learning. So this is an interesting concept. A lot of you may not have heard of it. But learning has different levels to it. And I'm sure there are two you're familiar with, which are the bottom two, which are memorizing and understanding. Everyone knows about these two, but most people think it ends at understanding here. That's not true. There's this huge entire area of higher orders of learning which is untapped into by most students. Above this are things like analyzing a relationship and then forming relationships and then creating concepts and applying this somewhere in there too. So when you reformat your mind map or your notes, or you make the material more understandable by changing its relationships, you're taking advantage of these higher orders of learning. And so your learning and your retention will become stronger. Amazing. So now that we do that, let's talk about the midweek revision. The midweek revision for me is teaching. And I should mention, all of this is active recall. None of this is done using notes or using information or anything. It's purely from memory. That's very important. So let's talk about teaching. How do I teach? Well, it's not that complex. I teach to an imaginary person. A lot of people like to pretend they're teaching to a 5-year-old. I just pretend I'm teaching myself from before I learned any of this. And I try to make it as logical and as intuitive as possible. So that session usually goes, if it's midweek, it's usually about 2 days afterwards. And then I actually end up usually skipping the 1 week. And it's just because in my medical school, I end up having exams every 2 weeks on average. And so there just simply isn't time. If I finish learning a topic the previous Friday, I'm not going to be able to do a 1 week revision before my exam the next Friday at 8 a.m., right? So I just go straight to the 1 month. And over here, I do a huge brain dump. So I redraw my mind map from scratch, write down everything I know. This is what I call high volume because it's just everything. There's no filtration. It's making sure I have it down. And usually I find that once this happens, my overall retention of everything is very high. Great. Now, this is good for having the general idea and a lot of the specifics, but this entire system is missing application. So sometimes, despite knowing everything about a problem and having the information to solve it in your mind, you may still miss it because you just haven't practiced it. And so that's where the final part, which is practice questions, come in. And there are a couple ways to do this. The way I do them is the way most medical schools do them, which is a mixture of a service called UWorld, which is practice questions that are in a similar format to that huge comprehensive exam I mentioned earlier. And then I also use the in-house practice tests. And this system, all of this put together, has managed to give me pretty high grades with less time than other strategies I've tried in the past. Just to give you an idea, when I initially started, I was doing just flashcards, which is what everyone recommended me. And that took about 4 to 4.5 hours per day, weekends included. And so for a 2-week exam, that came out to, I want to say, about 60 to 65 hours. Now, with this new method, I actually spend more time initially learning the concept. So on week 1, it's 5 to 5.5 hours a day. But then on week 2, it actually drops all the way down to 2 hours for review. And so this actually averages out to 50, 55 hours per exam, which is a really nice time save, especially when, I'm already trying to get extracurriculars and research and all these other things. So the last thing I kind of want to mention is, I know I mentioned this 1 week, 1 month, or 1 week, midweek, 1 day, 1 month process. This is actually fairly hard to implement, my bad. And so what I've done is I've made a template on Google Sheets that allows you to put in various subjects as well as your first review, and it will auto-populate when those upcoming reviews are supposed to happen. And then it will automatically send those reviews to a checklist app called Todoist. So you'll automatically see what you need to do every day the moment you open Todoist. And so I'll put that in the description as well. All right, so that's it. Hope it helps you out. The links to everything, again, in the description. There's a study guide in there. There is a coaching thing in there that is paid, but obviously you don't need to pay or for coaching. You can just get the material for free. And then there are templates in there as well. So go check them out and go do your work.